If you look at the demographics of the people who live with lupus, right, it's mostly women of color, women of childbearing age who are of color. And unfortunately, the participants in the study didn't really reflect the people who live day to day with the condition. And so after the drug's approved, now the sponsor, the pharmaceutical company, had to do another study seeking patients who self-identified as being of the Black race because they needed data on safety and efficacy. And that's what really that's something that really opened my eyes to see, well, by not participating in clinical trials, we're really slowing the progress for advancing care in our communities, advancing, medical and any medical progress, because there's limited data to really make an informed decision on how well diagnostic tests are working or how well certain medications are working. And so that kind of helped to shape what I've done in terms of the study that eventually became my dissertation, and also the awareness projects I've been involved in to make sure like underserved populations are aware of clinical trials.
Welcome to Public Health Careers. I'm your host, Omari Richards, founder of the Public Health Millennial. We're going to dive deep into public health topics and career journeys. You'll hear diverse career stories, absorb professional development and career strategies, get tips, while also learning from others to help you in your own journey and learning of public health. Learn about the vast world of public health careers, or just hear public health stories. Stay tuned so we can do our part towards a culture of health, well-being, and equity for all. Hey friends, welcome to another episode of Public Health Careers. In today's episode, you'll hear more about all things clinical trials, especially at the intersection of public health, clinical trials, and Black health. You'll learn more about progression from a clinical research coordinator position to a director of clinical services and how she really navigated those transitions. Learning that lab analysis done for clinical trials are based on white standards of eligibility and how that plays into health equity. Why she started consulting for more quote unquote work life balance and creating her unique impact, as well as learning about her consulting work she does around corporate wellness and why health of employees and individuals are so important. If you enjoyed today's content, all I ask is that you hit that subscribe button, leave a review, share it with someone who gets some value from it. This is truly the best way to support this is truly the best way to support the show, getting out to more people and helping other people learn, navigate, and transform their public health career journeys. So be sure to subscribe, to leave a review, and share it with someone. Greatly, greatly appreciate you all. Okay, now enjoy the show.
Hi, my name is Dr. Nadine Spring, and I am the owner of Springwell 360, and you are listening to Public Health Careers.
Today, we have an enthusiastic and results driven clinical research, public health, and wellness professional with a proven record of orchestrating health and wellness programs, community health initiatives, clinical trials, and research projects. She conferred a Bachelor of Biology at the University of Bridgeport, then went on to get a Master of Public Health and a Master of Science in Clinical Research at Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. She later got her PhD in Public Health from Walden University. She currently works as the Director of Operations and as the owner at Springwell 360 LLC. We have Dr. Nadine Spring, PhD. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, it is my pleasure. Always great to connect with another Trinidadian, as we were talking a little bit about before
Yes,
earlier on.
from
Yeah.
Toco, beautiful beaches, leatherback turtles, all of that.
Yes. I was in Trinidad earlier this year, but I was not able to go to Togo. But it is definitely beautiful out there, and I have not seen the leatherback turtles since I was a very young boy. So I should probably
That's what
try
I
to plan
love
to do
going
that.
back to see.
It truly is amazing that they come back there and they lay the
Mhm.
eggs, and you can literally just go so close to them. How do you identify, and tell us a little bit about your personal background?
Sure. So I identify using pronouns she, her, hers. And about my personal background, like I mentioned, born in Trinidad, raised in New York City, went to undergrad in the Northeast, grad school for the most part in New York at Mount Sinai. And then I moved to Georgia because my family had moved here. I have had my entire career in clinical research and public health, and that was something I never really thought I'd do. I landed there by accident. I wasn't a little girl going to, elementary school saying, I want to be a public health professional or I want to be a clinical research professional. That field actually happened to land in that field of public health by accident. And I've worked from entry level jobs, all, climbing the ladder all the way up. So yeah, that's a little bit about me.
That's awesome. And when did you move to the US from Trinidad?
So that was I was 10 years old, so in the
Okay.
90s.
Wow, that must have been quite the adjustment, I would imagine.
It really was. I think for me, one of the the biggest change, well, two of the biggest changes were in the US, the teachers don't hit. In Trinidad, I went to school at a times where the teachers were allowed to whip you.
I
Another
also got beaten in
change,
school. Yes.
another change is no uniforms. You could wear whatever you wanted to in public school here, whereas in Trinidad we had to have our sneakers very white, uniforms ironed and whatnot, well pleated, and and all of that. So those were some of the adjustments I had to make. And then having a Caribbean accent, having kids tease you even though you're speaking a lot of times better English than they are. That was some of the adjustments to make with the jump.
Yeah, I could imagine. And I prefer the uniform thing for school because I feel like it just cuts down on the decisions you have to make. But
Hmm.
people like their personal individualized choices and stuff like that as well. So, but yeah, I appreciate that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to hear more about how you found out and fell into public health. So before we get into any of that and into more of a like collegiate story, your background as a certified personal trainer and nutrition coach adds a unique dimension to your expertise. How do you integrate your wellness knowledge into your efforts to promote public health equity and address health disparities?
So for me, it's all really intertwined, right? I use, because of my background in public health and clinical research, I'm able to use evidence-based, data to drive, personal health, nutrition coaching, and whatnot. It's just not, if you look at some of the data and some of the fads, yes, you may lose weight on some of these fads, but then you gain it right back as soon as you end. So using the data to show what works for, sustainability and what works in the long term, that's how I'm able to integrate the two. And I'm always within wellness. I'm also always encouraging people, like even if they suffer from migraines or something else, to learn about a clinical trial that may help them, because participating in clinical trials have links to access to high quality care. And these, making sure that there's representation in clinical trials is one of the ways to bridge the gaps with health equity and improve some of the health disparities that we see. So I find I am able to intertwine, the public health background with wellness and nutrition and personal training.
And I love the multi-layeredness of that and just how intertwined all they are and the different experiences. I could imagine how it brings this unique perspective to how you are dealing with wellness and dealing with health equity, but very important in the work that you're doing. So your work also involves bridging the gap between research and community engagement. Could you share an example of community health initiatives or clinical trials where you successfully connected with underrepresented groups and achieve positive health outcomes?
Oh, sure. So community engagement, that would be, for instance, collaborating with disease foundations. So let's say, it's lupus or sickle cell. These are conditions that disproportionately affect people of color. And unfortunately, people of color are often not represented in the clinical trials and in public health research. So, it's kind of holding us back in some ways to advance science for people of color. And a lot of it tends to do with mistrust, and that mistrust is rightfully so. There were some horrible things done in the name of research. You think about Tuskegee, you think about what happened with Henrietta Lacks, where her cells were taken without her consent, and people got rich off of her cells, and all the scientific advances that were made. Um, being able to connect with these disease organizations, foundations, and helping to spread awareness of clinical trials, of research opportunities, whether even if it's just a qualitative research study or even a simple survey, just to gather data so we can learn more to see what direction we should head in terms of advancing care and improving quality of life.
So important, and thank you for sharing that. And I think
Sure.
it's so important, especially around the clinical trial aspect and just understanding many of the drugs that are out there and the pharmaceutical products that are out there have not been back tested on minority populations or black populations, I should say. And I think I was reading recently in a meta analysis, they were saying that in clinical trials, I think
43% of them didn't take race when they were looking at the people that were participating, or didn't report race or something like that, as well as there was something around the rate of Black representation in clinical trials span from, I think it was 3% to 16%, depending on what the clinical trial was
Right.
based on. So very, very important work to do to really get drugs that are efficacious for the entire population.
Absolutely. And here is another thing I learned in doing my research on this, diversity and representation in clinical trials. And this was eye-opening for me. In chatting with one of the PIs, one of the things I learned is that the lab thresholds for a lot of the eligibility criteria in these clinical trials are based on Caucasian values. So, of course, that's now going to mean a lot of, the minorities we now want to recruit won't even meet eligibility criteria just based on the lab values alone. So that was an, eye-opening thing for me to learn chatting with a PI on this topic.
That's fascinating, because that's another like layer of barriers and layer of ways to keep people out of this kind of important work and research that needs to be done.
And it just helps to add to the health equity and health disparities gap.
Right, right. So before we get more into your story and how you got into this dynamic like clinical research, public health, wellness intersection in the work that you do, I want to
Mhm.
ask, what does public health mean to you?
For me, I sum it up in one word: prevention. So public health means to me prevention. It's better to prevent something than to have it happen, and now you have to look for ways to either cure it or some control it. So I say prevention. So whether it's, type 2 diabetes, which for the most part is preventable, right? Um, Eating right, exercising, making sure you're having eating your, the right portions of veggies and fruits and whatnot, all of that goes a long way into preventing.
Backtrack into like your transition from Trinidad to the US, because what I've realized in my experience from moving from Trinidad to the US is that people just generally eat less fruit. And was that your interpretation when you got here as well?
Yes, because in Trinidad, we have abundance of fruit. You have the pomerac, the mangoes, the pomsite, everything just there. Breadfruit, which I don't even know if that's a fruit or a vegetable, soursop, and things that here you have to pay an arm and a leg for over here, right? And even I happen to be vegetarian, but even, like the chickens, the cows, the goats, one of the things I've learned in the process here is that everything here is highly processed. There's hormones, there's antibiotics being introduced. Whereas in, other countries like Trinidad and Tobago, you're not really seeing much of that. And so, things are less processed, and you have that dasheen bush growing in your yard, so people are eating more greens, more vegetables. But also, our culture is also very heavy on the floury food, right? Like, roti and and doubles, which delicious. So that also helps to contribute to some of the conditions we see over there. But you're right, one of the things I noticed, and one of the things I love about going back to Trinidad, is just getting the fruits I can't get access to here, the Julie mangoes and stuff like that I can't get access to here. And yes, I do see, especially when it comes to children's food too, children here don't eat as much fruits and vegetables as they really should. Whereas, from what I've noticed, a child in growing up in Trinidad and Tobago is getting abundance of fresh fruit and vegetables. Whereas here, a lot of it is pizza, chips. If it's fruit, it's often fruit in a cup with the syrup and whatnot in there. And what I've seen is very limited fresh fruit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will not put Trinidad out of the spotlight here, because they are definitely suffering with like very high rates of obesity and a high rates of childhood obesity as well. And it is interesting, because I think it is a lot of that importing of the Western culture into the society that has led to that. So like the uptake of not only our local foods, doubles, roti, and whatnot, but all the pizza and the fried
Yeah.
chicken, which is also pretty local, and then the lack of the culture around wellness and Because one other thing, just now before, just I'll get on my soapbox here. Because one thing, I went back to Trinidad. I was very there recently, and one of the things that is cool is like there's so many hikes in Trinidad, so many beautiful hikes in Trinidad, but it
Hmm.
just no one goes on these hikes. No one
I
like
was
even
just
thinks
gonna
about
say,
it.
like, growing up in Trinidad, we were on the beach playing football, on the beach, putting three sticks in the sand and playing cricket and stuff like that. And when I go back now, I don't see kids doing that when I go back. So that helps to promote, the obesity. It seems like the children are mostly indoors playing video games. They're, on TikTok and Instagram and all of that. And that could be promoting, helping to contribute to the childhood obesity being seen there now.
Yeah, absolutely. So many factors, and I feel like that could be a conversation all in itself. So,
Definitely.
so getting back to your journey. So you got your bachelor's of biology at the University of Bridgeport. Tell us about
Yes.
that thought process of going into undergrad.
Sure. So I was the first in my family to get a bachelor's degree. So doing that, there were so many unknowns, right? I went to college not really knowing what the bursar's office does. What does the registrar's office do? Like, not really, understanding fully the full scope of everything. So I went to the University of Bridgeport, and at the time, I grew up in Queens. After coming from Trinidad, I lived in Queens, New York. So University of Bridgeport was like less than an hour and a half drive away. Little did I know my parents had moved to Georgia, right? But part of my reasoning for going to the University of Bridgeport is I was sold on the fact that it was on the Long Island Sound. And if you are familiar with New York, that means like it's on the beach basically. It's on the beach in Connecticut. So those beautiful, beach-like pictures were something that sold me. And also, when I looked at some of the schools in New York, the state schools, a lot of them had really large classes. And I thought about myself and I said, I don't think I can succeed in a auditorium style teaching, right? University of Bridgeport, none of my classes were more than like 30 students. Every single one of my professors for my time there knew my name. And, I feel like that helped for, my success there. One of the things I also did was I looked at they sent out like these books with like your degree and your degree requirements and stuff, and I sat there and I said, okay, 18 credits is a full load, right? And if you're full time, you're paying for up to 18 credits. And I said, well, I'm going to take 18 credits a semester instead of taking 12 or 14. And I had a couple credits transfer because I had taken AP courses in high school, and by taking 18 credits per semester and having those couple credits transfer from AP, I was able to finish college early. So I finished in 3 years instead of four, which with my bachelor's in biology. So a lot of it really for me was planning it. Um, plotting which course do I take when, and making sure I had the prerequisites for certain courses taken before going on to the next one. So just plotting, like algebra is done in spring one, and then the next year spring I'll be taking pre-calculus and things like that because it's a prerequisite for the next course.
A lot more strategic than I think most undergrad students do, but definitely, definitely,
Well, tell
that's
me why I
awesome.
ended up being a researcher.
Hey, it makes sense. That makes sense. You're like this and then this and then this.
Right.
Um, but appreciate you sharing that, and I think that's a big consideration to think about when you are entering to undergrad program. Is
Mhm.
like how big is the class, and is that something that I would like to be with 500 people, or do I really want to be do I really want to be with 30 people, where the professor is really able to meet me and get to know me at a easier rate, and just knowing yourself around that I think is important, and then the bonus in there as well as like being close to the beach, which I think is something that you'll probably appreciate as someone from Togo.
Right.
All right. So during your undergrad, you entered there as a biology major, just to clarify.
Yes, I did.
Okay. And also like highlighting the point of the using the EP credits to transfer
Mhm.
across to finish undergrad in 3 years. Very, very things that I think a lot of us should be using more of or just knowing more of. But anyway, so during your bachelor's, you were a research investigator intern at Western Regional Health Authority, as well as a summer undergrad research student at Case Western Reserve University School of Medicine. So tell us about those two internship experiences.
Yeah, so University of Bridgeport is a small undergrad, liberal arts school. Well, they don't just have undergrad, they have master's and doctoral programs too. but they're not a established research facility. And so, as I was doing my undergrad, I needed to get some research experience because I'm thinking, what do I do with myself? I went into undergrad thinking I was going to be a doctor. I read Ben Carson's book, Gifted Hands, and I said, I want to be a neurosurgeon. Well, these two experiences kind of showed me what I wanted to do with my life and that being a doctor was not it for me. So they were summer internships. The first one was I was a research summer intern at the Western Regional Health Authority, and this is in Jamaica, not too far from Trinidad. And I did an asthma study there. The study was funded by the NIH here, and the PI, was was a PhD, and had students literally all over the world doing research. Some were doing research on HIV, nutrition, breast cancer, and my research was on asthma and the impact it was having on the health system. Kids being taken out of school, not able to attend school for a certain number of days per year, and all of that. So that was what I did. And for the other one that I did at Case Western Reserve University was I worked in a lab, and I did, in the lab, I was doing carrying out tests on mice because before anything can go to humans, it has to be done on, the animal models first, right? So I was doing things like that and Western blots, PCR, all of those sort of testing in the lab. So the thing I learned was the lab was not for me. Bench work was not for me. Forget about me ever doing an MD PhD. That just was not happening because, you had to be at the lab. If you started certain experiments and it wasn't finished, sometimes that meant you had to be at the lab working into the night or even into the weekend to get your experiment done and collect your data, right? And mice was not my thing. So I learned like that was not for me. But I did really like my experience working in public health at the Western Regional Health Authority and connecting with the lead PI on that study. And, I thought to myself, well, when I graduate, I, would like to learn more about public health. And I didn't go into college really thinking anything about public health. I went into college thinking, I'm going to be pre-med and I want to be a neurosurgeon. But in order to gain the research experience, that the University of Bridgeport didn't offer, I had to apply externally to these, summer undergraduate research programs, and that's how I that's how I spent my summers. And there was a stipend; they paid for the flights to come out, and all of that. So, how many undergraduates can say they went to Jamaica and spent a summer, 12 weeks there and was paid to do so? So, I mean, I
Not
had to go to
many.
work, but yeah, so it really was a great experience. And to this day, some of the people I met on that trip, there were six of us students in Jamaica that year. We're still friends. We still communicate.
Yeah, that's amazing. I don't think anyone is going to turn down that type of opportunity. So,
Right.
so I'm glad that you were able to do that. And it definitely seemed like you were intentional in saying, like, I'm going to this school. There's many research opportunities here, but I want to get that research opportunity. So how do I do that? Found these two internships. One of them was a summer research intern in Jamaica, which is really cool, and then the other one with the Case Western University. And I think through those experiences, you kind of learn that this lab work isn't for me. I'm not too sure if this doctor route is for me, which I think are very important lessons that we have to learn. And the only way to learn them, or the best way to learn them, and most convenient, is when we are in our undergraduate, when we get those experiences to really say, I don't think this is for me. Let me see what else I can do with it. And then you made the point that you thought about throughout that time that you wanted to study public health afterwards. When did like the term public health come up for you?
So that would be at the Western Regional Health Authority. So, because we were doing that asthma surveillance study there. So that was under a public health umbrella. And so that's when that term started really, collecting the data, analyzing the data, the incidents, and whatnot, all of the incidence rates and whatnot. All of that is what I was learning in that public health internship. So that I would say was the time I said, I really like doing this kind of work.
And you became a research assistant at Mount Sinai School of Medicine after you graduated. Can you tell
Yes.
us maybe a couple of undergrad takeaways and then how you came into this position as a research assistant?
it all just all aligned, right? So I when I was looking for jobs after graduation, because it was, well, I'm not going to medical school. Do I want to go to PA school to become a physician assistant? Do I want to go get a PhD? What do I want to do, right? And I started working at Mount Sinai as a research assistant because they hire you as a undergrad fresh out of college, entry level. And what I was doing was working in the ICU, recruiting patients and their families to answer, like, surveys about ICU, and also working with some other researchers to help them consent for whether they needed, blood samples or whatnot. But like I said, the lab work was not for me. Um, and so that's how I ended up working at Mount Sinai, and I really enjoyed it. And while working at Mount Sinai as a research assistant, fresh out of undergrad, Mount Sinai happens to have a graduate school, and they have a master's in public health program. And I started taking non-matriculating classes, intro to public health, biostats. And I fell in love with it, and I loved what I was doing. So I could go to work in the day, and then at about 3:45, leave the building I worked in and walk over to the next building to go to class for 4 o'clock, because my classes usually either started at 4 or 5 or 6. And I worked through my degrees. And yeah, that's how I ended up at Mount Sinai working as a research assistant, and then starting taking classes as a non-matriculating student, but eventually matriculating into the MPH program.
That's awesome. So just to clarify, you got your master's in public health at Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. What does that process look like for from going to non-matriculating classes into actually graduating from the degree?
So when I started doing the non-matriculating classes, it was more of, well, let me get my feet wet, right? I work here. I don't have to really travel anywhere. And this was long time before COVID, so they weren't really remote classes. Um, Everything was in person. You had to show up with your classmates, and if you were absent, you needed to say why, because you have participation grades and whatnot.
Mhm, mhm.
But that process of, starting as a non-matriculating student to then eventually graduating, it was like, wow, did I really do this? And I'll share, at my graduation, Bill Clinton was the speaker at graduation. So here I was sitting in, I think, the second or third row, and I'm like, wait, am I really here? A little bit of imposter syndrome, right? This man was just a few years ago the most powerful man in the world, and now he's standing just probably 10 feet away from me addressing the graduates, right? So it really was really powerful. And then, thinking about where I was going to go for next steps. Um, and, just taking a moment to see where I've been, and where I am now.
And looking back, what was that thought process to say, like, okay, I'm getting my feet wet with these non-matriculating classes. Let me actually go ahead and work towards actually getting this master's of public health degree. Was it that you just fell in love and you saw the passion there?
Yes, it pretty much was that. I fell in love with the two classes, and I said, I thought about my experience in Jamaica on the asthma study as well. And I thought, I have really good skill sets to do this. I'm really good at math, and, I had a bachelor's degree in biology. So I understand the science. I understand, certain things at the cellular level. And a lot of public health is math, especially when you're into epidemiology, the biostats, and understanding, all of that, the statistics. So that was more of that, yeah, that thought process. It's more of, well, what am I good at? What do I like? And where can I see myself? And so that's what led me to say, hey, I'm doing really well in these non-matriculating classes. Let me enroll in the program as an official student.
You became a graduate student intern at the New York City Department of Public Health and Mental Hygiene. Tell us about that
Mhm.
experience.
So that was a part of my degree requirements. I had to do an internship, and my internship was at the Department of Health in New York City. And I did a project on camphor poisonings, like mothballs and things like that. Camphor is in a lot of products. And I thought about myself growing up in Trinidad, how often they would rub camphor products on us as children, right? When we had for anything, any little cold, everything you got rubbed down, right?
Mhm.
But apparently, for some children, if they ingest these camphor products, it can lead to seizures. And so what I did was I looked at data from the Poison Control Center on calls coming in for camphor related poisonings. And, they wanted to really go out into a lot of these immigrant communities to inform them that, there are other ways to treat colds, because now you can, lead to seizures in your child if they ingest. A child's innocent. They don't know not to put it in their mouth if they ingest the camphor product that they're being rubbed down with. So that's the project I worked on. I also answered some of the calls coming in, like about whether it was like heat or something like that. I answered some of the calls coming in on the 311 line in New York.
And looking back on, I guess, your graduation and the entire experience of the Master of Public Health, and I guess that imposter syndrome moment when you were at graduation, do were you did you think it was worth it?
I've always thought it was worth it because it certainly opened doors for me that wouldn't have opened up otherwise. Um, you know, I'm a black woman. It's always harder for us to get from A to B than, another person, right? We always have to be mindful, certain things that we do are taken as aggressive, whereas if it's someone else, it's taken as, oh, they're being assertive, right? So you always have to be mindful of certain things. And, when you have the work experience and the educational background to add to your credibility, it certainly has. I've never regretted it, and it certainly opened doors for me. My only regret is that I wish it was free. I wish there weren't student loans tagged to it.
After you graduated, can you talk about these two experiences that you had before your next master's program? So you were clinical research coordinator at Northwell Health, as well as a manager for the lupus and anti-phospholipid syndrome center of excellence at Hospital for Special Surgery.
Yeah, so I would say these two roles like really help to shape my views on clinical research and my passion in wanting to raise awareness, especially for underrepresented populations, about the importance of participating in research studies. So I worked at Northwell Health in rheumatology, and so we did a lot of rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, scleroderma, myositis, dermatomyositis studies, so a lot of autoimmune conditions. And while there, that's when I started doing the master's in clinical research, because Mount Sinai was reaching out to us, alumni, and saying, "Hey, we have this master's in clinical research program. Your MPH credits will transfer over. You're welcome to come back." But it was a long commute because now I worked on Long Island instead of at Mount Sinai. So I needed to find a position closer and in Manhattan, instead of commuting out to class, at night. So I was able to land that position as the manager of the lupus center at Hospital for Special Surgery. And that's where I saw the need and the importance of having patient programs, of supporting patient education, patient awareness, advocacy, ensuring that patients are aware, because so often they're just not even aware of the options to their care. They may not, like, so many patients are never even told that a clinical trial exists that may help you with your condition. They just go along with the standard of care. And, the reality is we don't know if the clinical trial would help them or not help them. And, I participated in a study for a drug called belimumab. I was a coordinator for that study. And that study was approved by the FDA. And when it was approved, it was the first drug in over 50 years approved specifically for lupus by the FDA. Now, if you look at the demographics of the people who live with lupus, right? It's mostly women of color, women of childbearing age who are of color. And unfortunately, the participants in the study didn't really reflect the people who live day to day with the condition. And so after the drug's approved, now the sponsor, the pharmaceutical company, had to do another study seeking patients who self-identified as being of the Black race, because they needed data on safety and efficacy. And that's what really that's something that really opened my eyes to see, well, by not participating in clinical trials, we're really slowing the progress for advancing care in our communities, advancing, medical and any medical progress, because there's limited data to really make an informed decision on how well diagnostic tests are working or how well certain medications are working. And so that kind of helped to shape what I've done in terms of the study that eventually became my dissertation, and also the awareness projects I've been involved in to make sure like underserved populations are aware of clinical trials.
It's so important, and I think a lot of people, especially a lot of people in the Black community, are hesitant and to work with like pharmaceutical companies, and I think we understand, and you explained a lot about that context earlier on. But when you think about it in the broad context of we are the population that is disproportionately affected by so many of these issues, and we are the ones that are probably taking drugs at a higher proportion of the population, yet a lot of the drugs that are created are not created or tested with us in mind and with our biology in taken into consideration, which I think is harmful in all itself, and
Right.
that cycle perpetuates itself. So I definitely think there's so much more that needs to be done to ensure that Black populations and other marginalized populations are
Right.
included into clinical research so that we can have drugs that are efficacious, and we know which drugs are efficacious for which population so that we can have better health outcomes overall.
Exactly. Because there's so many social determinants of health that are, playing a role in outcomes. You have the LGBTQ community that's not really represented in these clinical trials, Native Americans, Hispanics, so many subgroups, but then it's not a one size fits all approach. And I feel like that's what a lot of these pharmaceutical companies are doing. They're having people at the table making decisions for people who look like me, but no one's at the table that looks like me. No one's at the table who really understands our lives, what it is that we need in our communities.
And that's why it's so important for each and every one of you listening right now. It's like take your part, like whether it's clinical trials or some other issue or opportunity, however you want to frame it in public health, is that we need people to take into those to get into those positions to really advocate for these communities so that we can get that large change, large systemic change that we need.
Absolutely.
So tell us more about that process of getting your Masters of Science and Clinical Research at Mount Sinai.
So a lot of my master's in public health courses transferred over, but then there were more in-depth classes for clinical research, understanding the different phases of the research, understanding like, when you do a superiority study or an inferiority study between, drug A and B, and, more in depth about that. And, because I was really starting to fall in love with clinical trials and clinical research, I thought, hey, there's no harm in in doing this new master's.
Absolutely, that makes sense, and that's awesome that your credits transfer over. I think that's always a good thing because it
Mhm.
helps you and it takes away some of that burden. And you spoke more about the jobs that you had before going into this master's program were really the things that made you see that there's just a lack of advocacy, lack of knowledge, lack of education around clinical trials, like getting people involved. What are some of the tools or the ways that you think we should approach getting marginalized populations into more clinical trials?
So we need to meet them where they are, right? And a lot of times they're not at the big name universities, big name academic centers. They might be going to a more local primary care doctor, to handle everything. A lot of these marginalized populations, they might not even be seeing a specialist. Even if they do need to see a specialist, they might be seeing everything with their primary care doctors. So I think we need to go into, these communities where these primary care doctors are. We need to have, alliances and strategic relationships with churches. We need to have some, community centers where they, where there's already rapport and trust, and, go into these communities and let them know, hey, we're here. Research isn't like what it was decades ago. Things have changed. There are IRBs and ethics committees in place now to make sure that your rights are protected. And I always tell, like, if I'm giving a talk about research, I always say you have more eyes on you as a research participant than a regular standard of care patient. The reason is as a research participant, your research coordinator is going to be asking, hey, are you feeling better? Are you sleeping okay? Even if you are sleeping better, or even if you now notice you have way more energy, the research coordinators, we all want to know that because we're documenting everything. Whereas you go to your doctor, the doctor prescribes something, you just go home. You don't hear from the doctor again or anyone from that office unless you have an issue and you call back, right? Um, And I share that, like, think about how Viagra came on the market for ED. It was not initially being tested for erectile dysfunction in the clinical trials. It was being tested for, heart conditions, angina. And, we noticed certain side effects of patients coming in and saying certain things, and the research coordinators were documenting it. And now we know Viagra is being marketed for what it is. So I always say, if you're a participant in a clinical trial, you have more eyes on you, watching you more holistically than if you were just going into your doctor routinely for routine care.
I did not know that about Viagra, and that is very fascinating. But I think it illuminates the point that you are being checked on, and they are. I think it illuminates 2 points. The first point, that like when we're testing drugs, we don't know what those side effects are going to be and how that is going to come out, going from a heart condition drug into erectile dysfunction drug, as well as the
Well, sometimes, maybe
oh
we didn't know that the drug would help you to sleep better, and now it is, but that's how we learn from these clinical trials.
yeah, yeah. And the second thing that I had there was that you are getting checked on a lot more than
Yes.
regular standard of care, and that is something that could have like improvements in your well-being, or just help you to better understand how you are feeling, because many times we don't have people, especially physicians, doctors, doing that for us on a regular basis.
Mhm.
So you graduated from your Master's of Science in Clinical Research, and then you became a Director of Clinical Research Services at Emory University School of Medicine. So tell us
Yes.
about that process and what you do in that position.
So I worked there for about 3 years, and a lot of what I did was developing programs for training the research coordinators, some new PIs, developing a research curriculum, lunch and learns, making sure we had the infrastructure in place to be successful with our, research studies. So making sure our research unit was staffed, we had we making sure we had area to store, the refrigerators, the freezers were all running appropriately. We had couriers if needed to take lab samples from one part of the campus to another for processing. So just a lot of the infrastructure work for making sure that everything was in place for successful completion of our research studies. So I ended up in Emory. I loved my position in New York, but New York City can be a pretty expensive city to live in. And my parents had moved to Georgia while I was an undergrad, and they kept asking me to move. And so eventually I saw this position. I applied. I didn't know if they would hire me or not, but I went through 4 rounds of interviews and eventually landed the position. Um, you know, I didn't want to leave New York and then have to start again. Because at that point, remember in New York, I started research assistant, research coordinator, then manager. I didn't want to have to come down here and then have to, step back and maybe be a research assistant again. I wanted to make sure it was a way to keep my career going, forward. And that position just aligned really well in going from manager to director.
Sounds like it definitely aligns and was
Yes.
and that's definitely, I think, something that we do have to think about as professionals in the workplace, or like workforce. Just thinking about, if we are trying to move somewhere, is are we open to taking a step back in position names or different things like this, or are we really trying to intentionally just continue to grow our career and wear those positions? And I'm glad that you applied to the job, and thankfully you were able to get hired after those 4 rounds of interviews.
Absolutely.
As you explained there, you kind of went from research coordinator into a manager into a director position. How did you develop like the managerial perspective, or that skill set?
So a lot of it, and here is one of the things I would share: volunteer, right? So working as a research coordinator or research assistant didn't really teach me any management skills. But volunteering on certain organizations, and I volunteered on the American College of Rheumatology, and I served on, I forgot what board it was. But by serving on that board, I was able to get a lot of experience on how meetings are run, how decisions are made, how to vet sponsors, how to vet, exhibitors at annual conferences, other things, other aspects of running an organization that I would not have gotten in my position as a research assistant or a research coordinator. And I also currently volunteer on the content committee for the Association for Clinical Research Professionals. And there I learn, or there I see the process on how do we inform guidelines for the FDA, and things like that. So I would say volunteering was one of the ways I learned leadership and management skills, like looking at how these leaders are, successfully leading, looking at how this person got from A to B, in their role. So volunteering is such a key part of it.
That's a key insight for anyone, I think, in their career, especially if they're in a role where they're not getting a lot of that training or that skill
Mhm.
set built. There are so many opportunities to volunteer. And I think back to like my master's of public health, and one of the things that really catapulted me into leadership was just applying to be the president of the Public Health Student Association. And
Right.
that just like transformed so many things for me.
Exactly. And sometimes the
Yeah.
commitment is probably 3 hours a month, sometimes less. So it's not like there's a huge commitment, but there's so much, value to be gained from it.
Absolutely. So after Emory, you moved across to Morehouse School of Medicine, where you took the
Yes.
role as a project director for the Research Centers and Minority Institutions
Mhm.
Coordinating Center. So tell us
Yes.
about that switch and then what you do in this position.
So that position I was very rewarding and purposeful for me. But unfortunately, I only stayed there for a few months. And that really had to do with a lot of the stresses of COVID and being a new mom and having to physically be on campus and daycare closing because COVID is now treated like the common cold now, but a couple of years ago, if there was one child with COVID in the daycare, that meant the entire class shut down. And now you have to go to work, physically be on campus, but scrambling to find someone to watch your child who should have been in daycare even though he's completely fine. And it was just way too much to keep up with, so I had to resign from that position early. But what that position did was it's a consortium of about 19 to low 20s institutions, and those are minority facing institutions. So we had University of Hawaii, University of Puerto Rico, Xavier University, so, like I said, minority facing institutions. And the goal or some of the deliverables for that program was to increase awareness of research, attract more underrepresented populations to be physicians, researchers, scientists, because there's data that really show that when your doctor is someone who looks like you, the outcomes tend to be better because they can relate to you, right? So that's what I did in that position.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that, as well as the realities of life and
Yeah.
the healthcare landscape, especially well, childcare landscape, especially during COVID-19. I know even outside of COVID, childcare is not something that is easy and for a lot of people. So I appreciate
And
you
it
lifting that
just
up as well.
exacerbated in COVID because there were so many. They ended up, a lot of these daycares had to shut doors because they were short staffed. The staff decided I'm not going to go work, with these kids because what if I get sick and now I bring it home to my mom and I get my mom sick and things like that. It was, so many factors that, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, as well as I work with a couple childcare centers, and I know they have a huge issue around like the 7-Eleven paying more money than they could afford to pay people and different things like that. So
Hmm.
the job landscape has made it hard for those
Right.
employees as well. And you got a PhD. I think you recently graduated with your PhD, so congratulations in public
Thank
health at
you.
Walden University. You're most welcome. So to tell us about like deciding to go and get another degree and a terminal degree in public health.
Yeah. So that that took a lot of thought process, right? And now my only regret is that I didn't do it sooner.
Mhm.
And when it came to deciding to do the PhD, as you've seen, you've talked about my background, University of Bridgeport, Mount Sinai School of Medicine. These are brick and mortar universities. Mount Sinai, brick and mortar institutions, face to face, they're not remote. Mount Sinai happens to be one of the top 20 medical schools in the country, things like that. So when I decided to do my PhD, and I'm the first in my family to go to college and get a bachelor's degree. It's not like I could have quit my job and, focus on school full time like other PhD programs do, right? So I looked at other programs, and what I loved about Walden was the flexibility, right? You could do it remotely. and they'd been doing it for decades. So it wasn't like they just popped out of nowhere. Part of the decision to do that PhD stemmed from wanting more respect in the field. So even though I was already well versed in clinical research and public health, and just and understand the intricacies of both fields, a lot of times when you're working with doctors and PhDs, they tend to feel like, oh, this is just a master's level person, I don't need to respect them, or they don't know what they're talking about, right? And that was my driving force really for getting that terminal degree, for getting that PhD. um, and I love the flexibility of being able to do it at Walden. There were so many times on my lunch break, I'd pull my laptop out and, answering discussion posts or looking up articles to back up what I was going to say or ask a student about. Because everything you say in your discussion posts at Walden University, you have to really back it up by data, back it up by peer reviewed articles and things like that. So um, just wanting more credibility and respect in my field was my driving force for deciding to pursue the PhD. And I chose Walden over a brick and mortar school because of the flexibility. And like at first I was really worried. I'm like, okay, is this going to be viewed as a diploma mill? But when I looked at the curriculum and compared it to other places, I saw, they were just, the level of academic integrity, the rigor was, for me, I thought it was higher, that and harder online than in person, having gone to in person schools before, brick and mortar schools before. And yeah, so that's what landed me at Walden.
And you said that the one regret that you had was that you didn't go sooner. Tell us more
Yes.
about that regret.
So I finished this year. I started in 2019. And one of the things that Walden ingrains in you from start is social change. What is your project going to do that is going to drive positive social change in this world, right? What impact are you going to make? And when you do a PhD, you need to have a niche area that no one else has ever done before. So my niche area was interviewing principal investigators on their views on diversity, their perspectives on diversity in clinical research. Now, there were tons of other studies that spoke to patients. There were tons of other studies that spoke to research coordinators, but no one had really spoken to the PIs. So that was my niche area. And yeah, so now that I've gone through the process, and and I'm always thinking about social change. What impact can I make? What impact is the work that I'm doing? How is that affecting people positively? And I finished my degree in 2023, this year. But the reason why I said I wish I'd done it sooner was, had I done it sooner, I would have had a PhD sooner and made my social change impact sooner. But you know what? Everything happens in the right timing, right? So yeah. But I did debate for a long time. Do I do it at Walden? Do I do it somewhere else? And I'm happy I chose the Walden community.
Flexibility doesn't sound like a bad way to go. And I know I've had many people who have had a degree from Walden University on the podcast now, and I like that framing of what is the social change that I'm making. And I feel like that's the framing that each and every one of us listening to this and doing work in public health and in social change should be asking ourselves, how are we doing that in the work that we're doing?
Right.
And the other thing is, I think is so important. Like, some people try really hard to think about what is the thing that they're going to study in their PhD program. I like the thought process, or the frame shifting of, like, people are studying clinical research and people are studying the patient's perspectives of it, the researcher's perspective, but nobody's asking what the PIs are doing. It's such a simple way to think about it, and as well as bring about such valuable information to this work
So
that we spoke about is important.
I want to share, now that I did the research, I know why people didn't seek the PI's viewpoints.
Mm.
PIs are often very busy, right? It was so hard to pinpoint time on their calendars to do this 30-minute interview.
Mm.
So now I know why. But I did it and I'm done.
That makes sense. And were there any things that outside of PIs being hard to pin down that were really, like, highlighted here that you think was very informative?
In terms of for what I found out from the research study,
Yes.
Yeah, I would say the main takeaway from the research study is that, well, there were two things I really learned, right? One of them was the lab thresholds, being based off of, white patients' values. And but then those are the thresholds being used across the board, whether you are Black or African American or West Indian or, whatever. These thresholds are what's being used to determine your eligibility. And the other thing that I found quite alarming is now, there's a recommendation from the FDA to have diversity in the clinical trial participants. But yet, there is no real formalized training on how to recruit, attract, and retain underrepresented populations in clinical research. So, if you want to be a PI, you have to have certain certifications, right? A lot of times they'll ask you for GCP certifications, the city training, things like that. But there's nothing really formal on how to attract and retain underrepresented populations in clinical research. So those were two eye-opening things for me when I did the research.
Yeah, well, bro, I appreciate you lifting that up, and that lab-based threshold, as I said earlier, that's wild to think about, and just like
Mhm.
another barrier in the race to get more diversity, inclusion, and health equity.
Of course.
Yeah. So you are currently, before we get to your current position, sorry. So
Hmm.
you, during your PhD program, could you just briefly talk on two positions that you had? You were a manager for clinical research, site and home health agency engagement, as well as an adjunct professor for clinical research at Gwinnett Technical College.
Yeah, so I was for the manager in clinical research, home healthcare agency engagement. What that was a position remote, and what we did were we trained home healthcare, like nurses, home healthcare research coordinators, on how to go into the homes of clinical research participants and get the research data. And that, I think, when done correctly, has can make a huge impact on getting underrepresented populations to participate in research, because now you don't have the barrier of having someone who lives 4 hours away from a research site, of now having to find care for their dependents, trekking out to the research site, maybe spending a night overnight, and now coming back home, right? If we can send the qualified trained staff to their home to draw the blood, do the assessments, all of that with them, then we can address some of the barriers of no shows and things like that for the clinical trials. For Yeah. And as for working as an adjunct professor in clinical research, um, at Gwinnett Technical College, they used to have a clinical research program. An adjunct professor is part-time, so you're hired as like an independent contractor. And unfortunately, they decided to close the program. I don't know if they weren't, retaining enough students, or what the issue was. But what I did was a lot of courses on, how do you know if study drug A is better than study drug B. So teaching the students how to interpret the results of a peer-reviewed paper, what the p-values meant, the different types of studies in clinical research, what the different phases are, just going through those, from A to B in clinical trials with the students. And it was a certificate course in clinical research. Most of the students in the course, when I taught, were foreign medical graduates. So a lot of them, they may have had a medical degree from India or the Caribbean. But, of course, if you have a foreign medical degree, you can't legally practice medicine in the US. And I guess they didn't really want to go through the whole process of residency and fellowship over here. And so going into clinical research just seemed like a logical step for them. But, you can be a fantastic physician but not really a good researcher if you don't have the training. And so they did that certificate course so that they could understand clinical research.
And you are owner and director of operations at Springwell 360 LLC,
Hmm.
where you believe it's essential to invest in your health in order to enjoy a life full of joy, gratitude, and satisfaction. And this is the full-time position that you have now. So tell us about that process, and like why do you start this organization?
Sure. So I actually started that business about a year ago. So I think about
Oh,
October of last
sorry.
year. That's fine. That's fine. That's fine. And what led me down this path was I wanted flexibility, right? Um, when you're working a 9 to 5, you have to be somewhere 9 to 5. And sometimes
Mhm.
with a little one, I really like remote work because you can, put the little one to sleep and then go and do what you need to do, meet your deadlines and whatnot. And a lot of what I do is wellness. Because when you take care of yourself, now you're giving yourself more energy. You're more productive during the rest of the day, and all of that. And some of what I also do is consulting for clinical research. So I'll train small research sites on, how to recruit, how to screen patients to make sure that they are meeting their target enrollment. So overall, consulting on wellness, clinical research, speaking opportunities is what I do with Springwell 360.
And as someone who was working in the clinical research space and then shifting into like entrepreneurship, corporate wellness, how did you go about like getting corporate wellness clients to work with and like marketing around the business?
A lot of it is just word of mouth and learning from others. Mentorship is huge. It really doesn't make sense to go and reinvent the wheel and possibly reinvent the wrong wheel, right? Because then that can be costly when you are running your own business. So a lot of it is mentorship. Talk to someone who's been there, and there's room at the table for all of us to eat. So talk to someone who's been there. Have lunch with them, have breakfast with them, have a standing monthly meeting with them, and see what how you can make your footprint in that space.
Absolutely. And are there any like big takeaways or like things that you enjoy most about this job outside of the flexibility?
Yeah, I love that I'm able to improve the quality of life of others. I love that, whether it's having making someone more aware of clinical research, or talking to someone and saying, here, well, this is the time you have to exercise, this is the time you have to meditate or practice mindfulness, because mindfulness, meditation, just taking a 10-minute walk, those they may seem like very little minor things and may not be on your priority list, but just doing that can have huge impacts in the long term, outcomes for your health and your well-being. So the thing I love is being able to improve the quality of life of others.
Yes, absolutely.
Mhm.
And before we move you on to the Furious Five and we end off the show, where can people connect with you and where would you like to see yourself in the future?
Sure. So in the future, I would like to see myself. I'm not sure I see myself in the US. I'd like to see myself maybe even I loved it in Costa Rica. The people were really friendly. Um, you know, maybe even living back and forth, but I still see myself doing this important work of advancing public health, advancing health equity, limiting those health disparities. It's something I'm very passionate about. So maybe tagging on to more organizations to spread the news and raise awareness.
And where can people connect with you?
People can connect with me on LinkedIn or via email, and I'm at Nadine Spring on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Awesome. And we look forward to seeing where all happens in the future and where that all takes you. And Costa Rica doesn't sound like a bad place to be. I've never been, but I've heard raving things about it.
So when I went to Costa Rica, one of the things that struck out to me is, I went on a tour. They don't have an army. They said, "Hey, we're very good friends with the United States, and the United States has promised to protect us," and they don't have an army. And I was like, "Oh, this no wonder these people are, they're so peaceful and, so welcoming and inviting." And I really loved my time in Costa Rica.
That is fascinating and a fun fact.
Yeah.
Thank you. So moving on to the Furious Five questions that I ask all guests. Number one, what advice would you give to a student trying to pursue a career in public health?
Don't be afraid to volunteer. That's number one, because there's so much you can learn from volunteering, and as you volunteer, positions could open up for you. That would be my main advice. Um, there's so much to gain: leadership skills, management skills to gain from volunteering.
Number two, if you were talking to someone wanting to get into your position, what advice would you give them?
It doesn't happen overnight. I would say create a 5-year plan. a very detailed 5-year plan. How do I get from A to B? If your goal is to eventually become vice president of a company, you're not going to go from, let's say your current job is research assistant. You're not going to go from research assistant to vice president. It's, it can happen. Anything's possible, but that's highly, very slim. Take baby steps. But also, don't be afraid to leave an organization. Personally, I have seen where I'm being overworked at one organization and they won't raise my pay. But hey, if I leave this organization and and I go to another organization, my pay goes significantly higher, right? Don't be afraid to leave one organization to another because the current organization where you are may not be willing to promote you, even though you're doing stellar work. And if you see that promotion somewhere else, for your longevity, for your personal growth, for your career advancement, don't be afraid to leave one company to go to another.
Appreciate that. Number 3, what's something you are working on improving in your life right now?
Balance. Balance is really important. I feel like sometimes I really want to do it all. I want to be super mom. I want to be, just but balance and giving myself just time to breathe and relax. I don't always have to be doing something. It's okay to just sit and relax sometimes. So that's something I'm working on myself for, just finding a good balance.
Number 4, professionally, do you recommend anything?
Um, I I liked Michelle Obama's books. I loved her book, Becoming. I like her new book, The Light We Carry, and I found them both to be very inspirational. So if it were to be, reading, if I were to recommend anything, I'd recommend her books. She was so candid about, what she went through with, being in the White House, listening to Trump's attacks, and so honest and I just gained a new respect for her. So I'd have to say Michelle Obama's books.
Appreciate that. I started Becoming, but I wasn't able to finish it. But I read the light that we are becoming. What was it?
The
Sorry.
Light We Carry.
Yeah, so I read The Light We Carry with my staff book club, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. So I would definitely recommend that, and I have to get back
Absolutely.
to adding Becoming to my reading list at some point in
Finish it
time.
up.
And number 5, if there was one piece of advice you'd give to your younger self, what would it be?
I would say don't be afraid. Going into unknown waters, I didn't know what college would be like. I didn't know what grad school would be like. And now here I am 4 degrees later. So I would say, just don't be afraid. Make that plan and get there. Yeah,
Love it, love it. Well, thank you so much, Nadine, for coming on and sharing your
absolutely,
insights. I
Omari.
thoroughly appreciated it. Yeah. So, housekeeping items, everyone. Thank you all so much for listening or watching this. Be sure to leave a like, be sure to subscribe, be sure to leave a review and share it with a friend. Those are the best ways to get the show out to more people. So, I appreciate when you all do that. So, subscribe, like, review, share with a friend. Thank you all. Peace.
All right.